Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the DCUSoccer Podcast. I'm back with my co-host.
Hey, what's up? This is Daniel Wise. How are you doing?
Yeah, so we're back. We're going to talk about the 1999 DC United MLS Cup winning season. Before that, we have some introductory stuff. I'm still stuck at home. I think you are too.
I'm still stuck at home, but I think I've said this before, but not a whole lot's changed. I've always been more, in terms of, hermit lifestyle, I'm more of the outgoing type, but, I still, prefer staying inside most times. So, this is just kind of pretty much business as usual as far as, my daily routine goes. But, I'm still doing my weight loss and stuff like that. So, down about 70 pounds this year. So, doing really good with that. And, a lot of it is just making sure that like I'm eating at very set intervals. And then, if I'm doing any type of workouts, I'm not going to gyms or anything like that. I'm usually just walking a couple miles, either at this empty mall that we have across town or just outside to downtown and back, just because this past week it's just been super gorgeous outside. So, I've been keeping on with this podcast, and then with that, and then recently I've gotten back into strategy video games because I started listening to this new podcast that I'll save for the shout outs. But I've been kind of getting back into those because I don't know, just with the life that I had before this, I didn't have a whole lot of time to dedicate to games like StarCraft 2 or Civilization 6. So that's pretty much kind of the hobby that I've picked up, aside from everything else. How about you?
Yeah, no, I think it's kind of weird just being at home for me, like literally 24/7. But I mean, I found it pretty nice to be able to focus on some things that I either haven't done in a long time, or like haven't been able to focus on as much. Finding myself with a lot more free time. So been working on like side projects, like I write software, so doing some of that kind of stuff. And yeah, it feels like, it's a little more stressful overall because of the whole pandemic thing, but I have found it useful to be able to get a lot more done and a lot more, learning and creating and stuff like that out, which has been really, really, really nice, and kind of helps with the stress, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So, interesting, kind of bringing that up. So you kind of had a very stressful time, last month. And so, what have you really been working on to kind of keep that in check, or, keep perspective, or, keep the stress levels down during these very uncertain times?
Yeah, no, I pretty much, so like as a profession, I write mobile apps. That's like kind of my thing, along with other like software stuff. So I have a few of my own mobile apps that I publish on the side. So like in my free time, I've been able to update them or create new ones or anything like that. So that's been like 90% of any time that I'm doing stuff outside of some of the other stuff that I've been able to do. But yeah, and if anyone's interested, I'll also link them in the show notes. But it's been a long time since I've been able to spend a couple hours every day on stuff that I'm really passionate about, versus coming home from work, just being exhausted from travel and work day and socializing, and then just wanting to pass out, right? So
Yeah.
it's been really, really nice to be able to get that extra time.
Yeah, I guess, for me, it's been a little bit different living in DC. Gosh, since probably 2016, it's probably been one thing after another. In terms of sort of like the overall atmosphere of that town when I was living there, there was, just because of sort of administrative changes, a definite cloud kind of came over that town, and just kind of working there kind of started to suck, and just like, it just became a lot, so, one of the things that's been good about being back here in South Dakota is that honestly, I've been given an opportunity to just really like slow down and breathe for a period here, and it's just, yeah, that's sort of what I've been able to do, is just sort of reassess some things, find out what's important to me, what I want to do sort of going forward, and kind of reflecting on what you know what things sort of brought me to this point, and what I can do differently going forward, that sort of thing. So it's been a good time to reflect on a lot of stuff, and also appreciate what I do have, and sort of like new opportunities that'll be coming down the pipe. So I'm just super excited for once all this lifts, like where things will be in a very different place, but I think personally I'll be more rejuvenated coming back out into the world once people start going back out into the world. So dealing with this crisis, let's hop in the time machine real quick, Ken, and let's set that dial for 1999. It was a different time where people were stressed out about a whole different thing. There was this thing called the Y2K bug. I was a fresh-faced, angsty 13-year-old. How old were you in 99?
So I would have been 5.
5, nice. Yeah. So do you remember anything from that time?
A little bit, yeah. No, I remember. I remember some of DC United being on, not specific moments or anything like that, but I remember it being on with my dad watching it and stuff. So I kind of remember that. I kind of remember some of the stuff he would buy, the memorabilia or whatever he would buy. I guess at that point it wasn't memorabilia, but
yeah, it was just straight up merch, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was just merch. So I remember some of that stuff from then, but yeah.
That's super rad. Who was your dad super into, from those like great, sort of early squads? I guess the dynastic squads, as we could probably say at this point, of DC United.
Yeah, my dad really, really liked Jaime Moreno and Marco Echeverri, especially in those early times. And then obviously Jaime kind of stayed a long time. But those were kind of the main two that I remember him talking about the most. And then a lot of Ben Olsen, kind of in the later years past this season maybe, which could have just been a result of me remembering more. But those are definitely like some of his favorites.
And this is great because this is the point where we really get to start talking about Ben Olsen, because he had just come and joined the squad in 1998. But before we get to that, let's look at, sort of the landscape of 1999. So this is the year when Who Wants to Be a Millionaire premiered and became just a gigantic, gargantuan event for TV. I remember watching that, every week with my dad, and just really enjoying that show. And then you had Total Request Live on MTV, and Carson Daly introducing Christina Aguilera and Korn videos. And man, when I started listening to Korn, that was when I really found myself during that time. And boy, I'm glad that version of me stayed back in that era. But it was also the time when the Euro was first introduced. The first ever episode of SpongeBob SquarePants premiered, and then George W. Bush announced his campaign for presidency. So a lot of stuff happening. It was, and I particularly remember, sort of that period. It was a lot of those great old Blizzard games came out. So you had StarCraft, and Diablo was going strong around that time. And then Valve came out with Half-Life and Counter-Strike, the mod came out that year as well. So like a lot of what 1990 or 1999 is like kind of sentimental. When I look back at it, I was like, yeah, 13 years old. That's a lot of what I was doing was, being super into the Matrix and, industrial goth music and stuff like that. So it was a special but confusing time for me. But getting away from that, let's talk DC United. So where do we want to start off at this point?
Yeah, no, let's start talking about maybe their coach for this season. Do you want to go a little bit into that and kind of the situation, and I can kind of expand on it?
Right. So Bruce Arena, he came in as the coach and led that team to just some incredible seasons. The first 4 seasons, I mean, DC United was in the final every single one of those years, and so this was coming off where Bruce decided that he wanted to coach the men's national team, and so what DC opted for was a special kind of a Flying Dutchman in his own right from Amsterdam. Thomas Rongen came in, and he was one of the inaugural coaches in MLS, coaching the Tampa Bay Mutiny. And if you remember, or I guess for our listeners, if you remember, we were kind of talking about those first couple of years. Tampa Bay was a pretty strong team, and so and especially teams that met up with DC United in the playoffs and gave them some pretty decent games. But he would coach New England from 97 to 98, and then came to DC in 99. And then he would coach there until 2001, at which he would be replaced with Ray Hudson. So what else can you tell us about Thomas Rongen of this time?
I think one thing that's interesting, not necessarily about Rongen himself, but that era, I guess, kind of talking a little bit more about the 99 and a couple years after, like that Bruce Arena men's national team was pretty good, and that kind of cemented Arena himself as one of the best coaches in the national team history at this point as we look back. Obviously also at multiple MLS stops, but think that's kind of really cool that Arena had been a DC, then had so much success at the national team level too. So I thought that was interesting to point out as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rongen is an interesting story in and of himself, where he was born in the Netherlands, but spent most of his playing and coaching time over in the United States. He was kind of a mainstay in the NASL days, back with the Los Angeles Aztecs and the Washington Diplomats, and I think a couple teams as well, but then stayed here in America and has coached a whole bunch of MLS teams. So, very, very interesting, how someone just kind of really embraces the sport here in America, or, really kind of did his own in sort of bringing along the sport here and showing, success here in the States. So, and I think, at the end of this 99 season, I think that was definitely a great sort of capstone to his time here, winning this trophy with DC United.
Yeah, no, totally. It's kind of cool because you don't typically see teams with a new head coach win the cup or title. That's kind of an interesting point as well. But yeah, do we also want to talk about maybe some of the players that we didn't talk about the 98 season because it was not a championship season, but we did have a couple players come in or roster changes. Did you want to go over some of those changes?
Yeah, so a little known rookie came in 1998. Ben Olsen, current coach of DC United, came in, won or earned Rookie of the Year honors in '98. Graduated from UVA and was part of this Project 40 sort of group of players that were brought in and allocated to MLS, really talented group, and he really sort of I think yeah, he just really made a mark here in DC. So he won Rookie of the Year honors in '98, and then in '99 made a great impact on the season, and then ended up as the man of the match for DC United in that final against LA. One of the things that the commentators were really sort of pressing on during the match when I rewatched it today was how physical Ben was. They were saying, wherever there was a scrap happening, you could put money on it that Ben was going to be in the middle of it. And he was just, this is, I think this is actually my first time actually seeing him in action. So having this chance to kind of see him work was just really impressive. And so, gosh, you see him during this time as a incredibly focused player, and he really brought that over from his playing days to his coaching days because he's still that guy. It was hilarious as I was watching the game. He had just scored the second goal for DC to go or to basically cement their win against Los Angeles, and so the reporter is asking him, how does it feel? I bet, how does it feel to get that goal and have this 2-goal lead against LA? And he's looking off in the distance with this look on his face like he's about to murder 11 players. And he's like, yeah, this feels really good. And, we're ready to go back out in there, or we're ready to go out in the second half and continue this on. And, it's just hilarious because he's like, this feels really good, but, the words aren't exactly matching up with his expression. And so I took a screen cap of him, of this is Ben Olsen happy. And really that's just him. He's just an incredibly focused guy. So you saw, someone who was a second year MLS player already in kind of like this veteran mentality. And that's just a testament to him as a player and today as a coach too. Just what they would say a consummate professional. That's who he was and is. And then another addition was Roy Lassiter, who was traded to DC in 1998. Played 2 seasons in DC, winning in 1999. He was also the team leader in scoring that season. And another interesting fact is that he finished out his MLS career with 88 regular season goals, and he was surpassed in 2004 by Jason Kreis. So, really talented player coming in and making an impact. They had just unbelievable players all around, but as you sort of alluded to, this would be short-lived after this season because MLS was going to enforce a pretty stringent salary cap the following season. In fact, another thing I'll kind of press into is how things really were going to change for MLS in the year 2000. And there was an interesting thing that they were trying out in this game in regards to time tracking for Major League Soccer games. And I didn't realize it before, but, they actually made a very significant, or there was a very significant rule that came in 96 and then they eventually phased out in 2000. So, I'll get into that later once we start talking about the game proper. What else can you tell us, or what can you tell us as well about the 99 season overall?
Well, I mean, just to back up a little bit about Ben Olsen, I mean,
Yeah.
to your points, definitely that was always kind of his thing, the gritty, the working hard, and being physical, and you definitely kind of see that in today in his player selection, and pretty much everything as a coach. And what he prefers and stuff. So yeah, I definitely think that's important. I'm glad you got to see the game and Olsen at work, but yeah, definitely one of my favorite players, definitely, and kind of why he's on our Mount Rushmore. Really, he's just really, really great player, but also the way he played was, so gritty and hardworking and everything. But yeah, I mean, he's now the coach, and that's been interesting. But this goes back a long, long, long time. So I definitely think that's awesome that we're kind of starting to see the fruits of his playing as we go through the history here. Um, but yeah, I actually am kind of interested a little more in the rule changes that you were talking about. I know we can kind of talk about that and kind of how it shaped MLS for, a good 10, 15, 20 years and how things were going to work and setting the league up for some of the stuff that was to happen.
hmm So it's interesting because in certain ways they were they were weaning some things off of kind of like the Americanization of soccer, particularly in how the flow of the game was presented. I think at this point they had pretty much done away with like the ending ties with or all tie games with PKs. Can you confirm that? I'm kind of assuming at this point, but
I think that was after, but yeah.
was it after? Okay. But I guess just to kind of talk about what they were doing is in 2000 they decided that they were going to sort of change the way time was kept, and so I didn't realize this until now, but games always counted down from 45 minutes per half down to zero, and they would pretty much stop the game dead once those 45 minutes were done. And so they decided that in 2000 they were going to switch to the European model of having time kept on the field by the referee. So this would mean counting up from 0 to 45 and then having the additional injury time accounted for at the ref's discretion. So they were going to do that in 2000, but they decided for the MLS Cup final that they were going to essentially implement this new rule. So they had the referee basically counting how they do in Europe. And so with that, happening, it sort of showed that the American version of the sport was going to start leaning towards the European model. But at the same time, bringing in some more kind of American tradition, or I guess sporting rules, like you sort of said, with a salary cap. And so you had kind of like interesting sort of push and pull where, it was adopting some aspects of the European style, but at the same time, keeping some very, very American rules within the sport. So, yeah, just again, these early years of Major League Soccer are just fascinating with how they were trying to essentially figure out the rules of the game and how they were going to format the games themselves. So, just super interesting to see this all sort of shaping up. And I mean, I think some people can probably make fun of it to a degree, but like, if you look back at England during, the 1800s when soccer was kind of, or it was a brand new sport, it was a clown car sport as far as, if you were to look at it tactically and overall with the rules, it was a garbage fire back in those days. And so, I think some people clown on MLS for some things there, but I have to kind of pause and say, hey, during this time, it was a relatively new, sport here in America. So, it's just interesting to look at how those things were changing.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, in terms of thing being a garbage fire, maybe the current DC United would have done pretty well then. Um,
In what way?
but just because the way they play, I guess. It just,
Yeah.
um, I'm just kidding, just kidding.
Well, no,
But
I one of the things that they pointed out was, particularly between the LA Galaxy and DC United, it was a really hot rivalry because you had LA, which was really good in the West, and DC that was really good in the East, and while a limited history, they had totaled up between all the games that DC and LA had together up to that point. Uh, they had averaged nearly 30 fouls a game and 4.5 bookings. And then I think like maybe something they had a couple, or maybe like a half a percentage point of like ejections or something like that. But like it was kind of a notoriously dirty rivalry at the time. Like the two teams, even at the end of this game, almost came out into kind of like a brawl towards the end in the second half of injury time. Things like nearly boiled over because someone got chippy in the near the sidelines, and they just about like went at each other.
yeah, no, I did. I do remember some of those, like not necessarily this early, but LA and DC being rivals, and you kind of don't hear as much about it today, but definitely was pretty big back then. But yeah, in this year they had both won on the road when they played each other too. So this MLS Cup game was set up pretty well with all these things considered. Did you want to move into the MLS Cup game in the playoffs?
Yeah, for sure. So this took place November 21st, 1999, and this was a sort of repeat of the 96 final between LA and DC because this took place at Foxborough Stadium in Massachusetts, of all places. I have no idea why they went with this again, but I guess they were still trying to experiment with neutral grounds or whatever. But in this sort of incarnation of the DC LA final, LA didn't really have the excuse of bad weather to kind of lean on in terms of the results. So it was a pretty gorgeous day in Foxborough, and both teams came out. I mean, just firing strong. And I think it was an early injury to one of the LA Galaxy players. So Fraser went out with a shoulder injury, and he was a strong leader on defense, on the best defense in MLS. So LA lost him very early in the match. I think it was about 7 minutes in that he went down, and so he was replaced, and I think at that point, LA was still trying to get after DC, but it would just be, sort of a handful of minutes after that when Jaime Moreno would score the opening goal. And, the thing about the two goals that DC scored in this game was that they were kind of, or at least the one that Moreno scored was pretty routine. However, the one that Ben Olsen would score towards the end of the half was kind of a comedy of errors in a way, and this was sort of like a thing that was kind of uncharacteristic of the LA Galaxy, is that they were you had DC, if they hadn't been the best team winning the Supporters Shield, it was going to be LA, because I mean they were the strongest in the West. They were just a really well put together team. If you were talking about sort of two of the arguably best teams facing off against each other in the final, this was it. And they were also coached by a very strong
Ziggy Schmidt.
Ziggy Schmidt, yeah. And so they had a really strong coach in Ziggy Schmidt, who was prolific in his college days. And so he was looking to get his championship in MLS. So you had a team that was coming in really organized, really hungry. But I think what sort of happened is that they expended so much energy coming into this game that DC was just sort of somehow able to outlast them. And that sort of became the story. Both of them going really strong. And then by the end of it, DC, they just had to kind of play, I guess what they would call Benny ball these days, sitting back on defense in the second half. And then for LA, the only player who is really still trying to make an impact or still trying to get things done in that second half was Colby Jones. And it just was not working out for them. So DC kind of walked away with a, what would be considered a pretty breezy two goals and a win in this game. But that first half was something that they really had to scrape out. And, they just sort of showed that they were the more physically imposing team in this match.
Yeah, no, totally. And also, I did notice that of course Ben Olsen got booked in this game,
Yep.
as well as being man of the match. So I thought that was kind of cool. Something I didn't know before, but yeah.
I mean, there were 5 bookings in this game. So LA had 2 with Colby Jones and Roy Myers both getting carded. And then for DC, it was Kerry Talley, Ben Olsen, and Diego Senora, all receiving yellows. So this kind of shows like both these teams were just ready to kill each other at any time in this match. And that just really showed how intense these two teams were.
Yeah, no, totally. And like you mentioned a little bit before, at the halftime show, there was Christina Aguilera with Genie in a Bottle as well.
Yeah, just absolutely. This was 1999 as hell. Like this was just looking back at it. It's, I don't know. Like I said, it makes me feel a lot of things, in terms of a sentimentality, but also kind of a weird feeling as well, because man, I think between 99 and probably 2008, I think was like a cultural dark age here in America, where everything was just broed out, like, and kind of ridiculous. And like 99 was also that Woodstock concert as well. And you could say that's sort of, if you know how that all turned out, that's sort of how I think of that whole time frame that I just explained right there. Just a gigantic fire out in the middle of nowhere. And so that was 1999. And yeah, it was just hilarious kind of looking back at this. I actually do want to point out that I was sort of tripped up when I was watching this game. So another player that, kind of like I think a little known player, but actually was really surprising to me in a couple regards during this match was Carlos Lamosa, who was a immigrant from Colombia. And interesting about his story is that he was working at the World Trade Center when it was attacked by terrorists, except it was the first attack in 1993. So then I was sort of, when I heard them talk, the commentators talking about him, I was kind of like, they were talking about this tragedy at the World Trade Center. I'm like, wait, what? I was like, oh no, that was the 1993 like car bombing that happened. So, it was kind of one thing interesting about sort of like his story and how he actually got away from the building when it happened because he was out on a lunch break of all things. So he was spared from that tragedy, and then eventually found himself playing MLS soccer. So wonderful story about that, sort of a serendipity. But then also being a guy who, if you look back at this game, you have Ben Olsen being named a lot as sort of like an impact player, but Carlos as well also had this mean streak in him, and he was scrapping it up with pretty much everyone during this game. So little shout out to him, and I think especially a player who often is probably either forgotten or is just not known in sort of like the pantheon of DC United.
Yeah, no, totally. Great call outs there. So yeah, did you ready for the CONCACAF Champions League run?
Yeah. So I think just like I think the early years of these CONCACAF matchups kind of tell a lot about as great as DC United was. I think the best teams of MLS were still sort of a step short of Liga MX or of those Central American teams. So what can you tell me about the CONCACAF Champions Cup, or what did you pick up as you were sort of looking through the table and then the matchups?
Well, I think the main thing, kind of similar to what you said, is that like they're still behind those big teams, right? But I was kind of impressed again. Like we actually talked about this on another episode recently, but like I was impressed by how far a lot of these MLS teams did get. Definitely, I feel like if you did the math, we would have we being the MLS teams done better then than we do now.
Yeah, and sort of like the interesting thing there is that with the third place game, it ended tied 2-2, and they just kind of left it at that. So they shared third place between Chicago Fire and DC United. It was just like, yeah, game's over. This is done, and you both have it. So whatever. So I just thought that was kind of funny that there was no kind of like true result for that position. But it was Necaxa. That's who ended up winning, and they were a Liga MX team, and they beat Costa Rican side. I think we're still in a period where I don't know. There's been talk lately about Major League Soccer and Liga MX combine. I mean, it's been tried before. Like they've tried to do kind of like a Superliga type of format. They've tried to do something to kind of like combine the competitions between Major League Soccer and Liga MX and seeing how that all shapes up. But what are your thoughts? Is Mexico still sort of, could you still say like it's still leagues ahead of where Major League Soccer is, or have that gap shrank, sort of since that time, in the course of 21 years, of sort of like 1999 to 2020, has the gap shortened? Has it remained where it is? How do you see Major League Soccer in comparison to the Mexican League?
Yeah, no. I definitely think we're farther behind. If you look at stats and payroll and stuff like that, it's hard to say that we're close at all. I mean, I would say Mexico, their top division, Liga MX, is a top 10 league in the world, and I would say Major League Soccer is probably top 20, 25. In terms of talent and stuff like that. So the relative distance is probably, I don't know, 20, 30%, but there's a lot of gaps there if you try to compare, all the leagues in the world. So yeah, I mean, it's really if that gap wants to be closed, they need to open up more spending. That's the only way to get there. And that really means two things. It means more at the high end, so more of those designated players. But we also need those people coming off the bench at that high TAM level, or low DP level too. So we're pretty far off. I would say we're probably on average, per team, probably at least really simplistic terms probably, but two or three TAM level players and a DP on average away from the Liga MX. But they're going to go through some rule changes here soon, and a domestic player rule. So you could see them slip a little bit. But that doesn't really help us either. If there's less competition and they're weaker, it doesn't make us stronger. I think the more competition we can get with them, the better. That's my personal opinion. A lot of people don't like that, but I think it's really important, and I think it's really important that we have more competitions with not just Mexico, but also those other Central American sides to help them grow as well. But it's a different setting, different experience, but yeah, I mean, this idea that MLS is super close to Liga MX is just not really true, and you can see that reflected in the national teams too. It's a good 20-30% behind, I'd say.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, if you did any sort of combination or I guess combining of the leagues where, Jesus, what happens if you have, I don't know, Cincinnati going up against Club America or Pumas or Monterrey? It would be a bloodbath, to say the least. And say, it'd be like one of those things where, like, would you want to see that twice in a year or something like that? That type of matchup. And I'm just kind of pointing out Cincinnati because they are, so awful. But, throw out any of the sort of, playoff missing, or the teams who miss out on the playoffs in Major League Soccer, how they would match up against, sort of like the bigger clubs in Liga MX. It's not even close in that regard. Maybe they can match up closer to more of the bottom or mid-table teams over there. But at that point, it's a sort of again, sort of like you're talking about a league that's so gargantuan. Like at that point, what does it matter? It's kind of it's weird because there's been some talk about or speculation about it. But if you were to combine the two leagues, it would come out to a gigantic 54 squads in sort of like a combined Major League Soccer and Liga MX Super League or whatever. That's completely ridiculous, especially if there was no promotion relegation. It was just a gigantic league. It makes no sense. And you would see more MLS teams on that bottom side of the 54 than you'd see towards the top of that table.
Yeah, no, I think you touched on an important point too, where like the difference for the most part between the MLS and Liga MX is on those extremes, right? Like our worst teams are way worse, and we have fewer of those really, really top teams. So like our middle is kind of, it's a little bit comparable. You have to shift a little bit because of the number of teams and the distribution weirdness, but it's really, pulling that bottom up would help a lot of MLS, and solidifying that top side too with a little bit more to kind of pull in that distribution if you're thinking about it, and reverse flatten the curve, I guess you might say.
Right.
A little bit, or different distributions might work too, but. It's pretty far. Tigres, Monterrey, America, Leon, all these teams are going to crush almost every team, and not maybe not LAFC and Atlanta or whatever, but pretty much else, those are better teams than anyone else in MLS.
And I say this as someone also knowing like DC United would be at that bottom end of that table. At least, with our current iterations, all respect in the world to Ben and what he's trying to work with this squad. But boy, considering the opening that we had, it's just, basically we lucked out with our second game against Inter Miami. That could have gone a completely different way, and it was really looking that way towards the beginning of the game. I think we're good as far as, we don't need to rush to try to combine things or anything like that, because I mean, at that point, if you're talking 54 teams and only 16 to a playoff, well, I think about 14 of those teams would be Liga MX teams. That's just sort of how I see that, maybe.
Yeah, the combined league stuff. I mean, a lot of stuff would have to change before that, so I'm not too worried or really considering too much about it at this moment, because I don't think it's going to happen. But, weirder things have happened. Weirder things inside of MLS have happened. So, yeah.
For sure. Well, yeah, so that was sort of a look back at 1999. Anything else you want to kind of point out, or anything you think we missed sort of covering this? It's really tough to kind of like cover a whole year within an hour, but did we pretty much cover everything that you saw looking at the sheet?
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, like you said, it's really hard to get as much as you would want to talk about in under an hour, so you kind of have to pick the top things there. But yeah, I think we did a pretty good job. Yeah.
So, anyways, to close it out, is there anything you came across or anything you wanted to sort of talk about in these final minutes of the episode?
Well, I think we can move on to our shout outs or whatever. Did you want to go first?
Yeah, so I have one that's soccer related, and one that's sort of outside the realm, but they talked about some very sports related things this week that I thought was really interesting. So sort of for the first shout out, I want to give a big shout out to Tried and True, the DC United post game podcast. They've been having a rough go, lately with no DC United games going on, but they had a recent episode where they talked about what we just talked about with the, sort of speculation of the Mexican and American leagues combining together, and they had a pretty lengthy debate about that recently. So they are a group to check out. Look up Tried and True on your favorite podcatcher, and then it is Tried and True DCU on Twitter. And then the other shout out I want to give off is to this podcast I recently picked up called 3 Moves Ahead, and this is kind of going off what I was talking about earlier, getting back into strategy video games. Is 3 Moves Ahead is essentially a podcast that talks about just that. They either pick out a singular topic about, sort of game design, or they'll talk about a singular game, and they'll really like get into the weeds about whatever game or topic they're talking about. And it's hosted by Rob Zachney, who's one of my favorite guys, who talks about video games, and he's I think he's editor over at Waypoint, and so he's a really good podcaster, and I really liked his show. And they talked this week about how sort of different leagues have been trying to deal with this COVID-19 thing, and how, either TV stations have been running like simulations using MLB The Show. And so like, I think there's been a station over in Chicago playing Cubs games just on this PlayStation 4 game. And they just sort of run it as, sort of the season was supposed to go. They just show the game on the days they were supposed to have games. And it's kind of this weird disconnect where, like, yes, this game's technically happening, but there's no like storylines connected to it. They thought it was really weird, in fact, like if they go this route, like some of these like either station people or journalists are going to have to find this like inner Dungeons and Dragons nerd and like create storylines from this stuff, because that's what like really holds people into sports, is that type of angle. And then they also talked about, FIFA and what's been going on with it, and how it's been handled during this whole virus situation as well. And so it's just a really interesting episode where they kind of get into the weeds about what different leagues have been doing with simulation sports. So it's always a fascinating listen, and that show is just highly recommended.
Cool. Yeah. Awesome stuff. I wanted to do this is a little bit bigger than my normal shout outs, but it's a podcast that I've been listening to for a while called the MLS UK Show. It kind of gives a perspective from the UK, which again, like I mentioned before, but I kind of find really fun and interesting. And so, yeah, they have a great show. They're on Twitter at MLS UK Show. And I'll also link to their site and other stuff in the show notes. So, yeah, I really enjoy their stuff.
Yeah, no, that's a great show. And a good friend of ours, James at DC United Kingdom, he's part of that MLS UK network. And so, just huge plaudits to them for really, kind of embracing our style of soccer over here in America and trying to sort of ingratiate it to, a UK audience. So I just think that's super cool that they've really like taken up the mantle. So much appreciated from those guys.
Yeah, totally. And I think that'll wrap this up. Yes. So if you would like, please leave a rating on iTunes or whatever podcast app you use. That'd be great. I think we promised that, if you write a review and it's, not super obnoxious, we'll go ahead and read it on the podcast. I haven't checked them in a while, but yeah, leave one and we'll shout it out on the show. You can find me on Twitter at DCU_soccer. Daniel, where can people find you?
Yeah, so you can find me mostly on Twitter and Instagram, and I'm at SDakotaSoccer. And yeah, as far as like reviews go, that's, we'll definitely read those out. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, and I think particularly on my end, I've been trying to get newcomers into the sport. So I love kind of helping people understand the sport, especially if they're fresh to it. I'm the type of person who likes taking any and all questions, whether it's about the rules or, the business side of things or whatever, how everything works. I really love discussing that stuff. So that's where you can find me, and definitely drop those questions into my DMs, and I'll be happy to talk shop.
And yeah, so that's it for today. Also, special shout out to Ben Olsen's birthday. I don't know if we mentioned it, but yeah, it is his birthday, so that's kind of fun, especially on this episode where we kind of talked a lot about him and his early impact starting out. And yeah, we'll be back with a 2004 episode soon. So yeah, we'll see you then.
Take it easy.